democracy and participatory democracy, to see how much we've outsourced the labor onto people who, don't get paid any more than like maybe $25K a year, and basically like slave away and have no life and no days off and no expectation of privacy. But those are the people who are really running the election. So post my election time, post my woke time, I'm like, every collection I write is going to have an election story in it, or like an activist movement story to sort of help. Hopefully they're entertaining, but also hopefully they like shed some light for people of like, what you see on TV is not always what's happening when we talk about elections, when we talk about politics.
Mm-hmm. So with that, could you tell me a little bit more then about your short story collection, Dark Corners, how it was, because it's your first, I believe, it's your first short story collection. So could you talk about, a little bit about like if there's a way to summarize it a bit more. Also, how is it being published, and how did that come about?
Yeah. So it's, I'm sometimes struggle with like, what is like the catchy elevator pitch synopsis of the book, but, or the collection, but it's really like, it's a collection of very quirky stories about the intersections of America that we don't normally get to see, or that don't normally predominate our narratives, right? So it's not a bunch of white men falling in love with the manic panic pixie dream girl and learning something about themselves as they destroy her. It's a lot of queer characters, a lot of queer people of color. It's a lot of racially ambiguous characters. Mm-hmm. People who are sex workers, people who are social media managers. And every story is sort of about this like meeting place of, or about these intersections, these like shared meeting places where different ideas, different things kind of come together in unexpected ways. Which is why I called it Dark Corners. 'Cause I think that sort of like sums up the kind of like the kinds of people you run into in dark corners, and who are they and why, and what that is about. And it's getting published by Running Wild Press, which is, I'm in California, and this, is this independent press out here in California. They're relatively young and new, and, they sort of do brand themselves as like publishing, writers from marginalized communities. So people of color, women, LGBT people, those are sort of the voices that they're like looking to uplift. And so when I heard that, I was like, good, here's my manuscript.
Oh, great. So how did you first meet that publishing company?
So so the publisher, Lisa, I went to grad school with her. She graduated several years before me. Mm-hmm. But she was not the first person that I reached out to. And when I moved out to California, ran into her socially, and she was talking about her press, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was fully planning on self-publishing my collection. Mm-hmm. Like I had hired an outside freelance editor. I had like hired a graphic designer. I was about to hire somebody to like digitally put it in ebook form and just go balls to the wall and try to do it myself. And Lisa was like, oh, you should send it to me. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I sent it to her, and she got back to me, fairly quickly of like, oh no, we can publish this. Like let us do some of this work also, which is great. But I had sent it to, so like, I guess from working in politics, I'm a big believer in like, who in your network and your connections mm-hmm. is like a good way of getting your foot in the door. So I had sent my manuscript to like several classmates who have gone on to start, publishing companies or like, their own labels, to put out work. And so it was the awkward rejections of being rejected by people you went to school with. People who were in workshops like, your writing is so great, I can't wait till it gets published. And then they're like, we're not going to publish this. Yeah. And I'm like, ow, it's a different kind of sting. But,
Yeah.
of course, all the feedback I got was like, it's not that the collection is bad. It's just that it's not the kind of thing that those particular publishing companies felt like they would be good at selling, which was an aspect of the literary world that I didn't really get to realize until I was in graduate school, which is how much that's reliant on that. Like, what is the style of which you write? What is the content of which you write? And that things like agents and publishers, kind of really find their niche of like, we're really good at pushing this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the only stuff we're going to push. Or like agents who are like, I'm really good at selling these kinds of books. So I'm only going to take on these kinds of writers. And so like when you get rejected, it's not so much that it's like, oh, they hate you, they hate your work. It's, they don't believe they can sell it. Mm-hmm. Which is what I had to tell myself after several former classmates or several alumni of my, or alumnus with me were like, no, we're not going to do this. Yeah. But Running Wild Press, that's their brand is, writers from marginalized communities, and like, uplifting these voices that we often don't get to hear in mainstream media. And so because of that, it's a really, really good fit.
Oh, that's great. With your, the process that you went through after all the rejection, I know you mentioned it briefly about just kind of telling yourself that's not exactly their, what their focus is, but were there certain things that you had to learn or teach yourself to get past the fear of continually putting yourself out there and then maybe getting rejected, and how did you be able, to continue to move on past those?
Oh man. So when I was an undergrad, I really didn't give a shit and was just sending things out to every single online or print literary journal, that I could get a hold of. I was, I was told in undergrad that like the way you go about publishing is you either do the targeted, directed, I think my work fits really well for this publication, so that's the track I'm going to focus on. Or you do the like spaghetti at the ceiling, like you just send everything everywhere and you see what sticks. And so I've always been, or I started that way of being that guy of like, I'll just send everything everywhere because I don't know these people and who cares. So I used to have a very healthy level of rejection. And over time, it was like, it's the one or two rejections that really stick with you that ended up being the ones that sort of like crushed it for me. And I also used to like systematize, submissions. So I would say like every Sunday afternoon, I'm going to sit down and, regardless of how many tears or blood is shed in that like 3-hour period, like that's the period that I submit stuff. And I was really, really good at that. And I started to rack up like a lot of like online journals, most of which don't exist anymore. This is back, in the early half of the early 2000s. But I had two really, really bad rejections. So the first one was, I forget the name of this online zine, but they rejected me within 5 minutes of submitting. And that kind of hurt. I was like, I don't even think you read this, or like maybe you read like the first 3 sentences and were like, nope, it's done. And so that really hurt. And I was like, dang. And like, that's like one of the fastest turnaround rejections I've ever had. The second was the longest time it took for me to get rejected, which was in grad school. So one of the stories in my collection, like when I got at workshop, my very first workshop in grad school, the professor was like, this is actually perfect. I wouldn't change anything. I could see this in the New Yorker and you should send it to the New Yorker. So we sent it to the New Yorker passed. I sent it to, I won't say the name, another very high up there literary journal, and didn't hear back anything. But because they were so big, I did not send that story or show that story to anyone for almost 2 years. Because I was like, oh, I'm waiting to hear back. One day I'll hear back. Like, they're super busy. This was unsolicited, so it's in a slush pile, but like, I believe in this story so much. that I know it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. And like almost 2 years later, I get an email. I even stopped using that email account because life moves on, but just happened to randomly check it. And I get a letter from them, an email from them. They're like, oh, sorry, our computer system, we switched over to a new computer system. We lost a bunch of data, and we had lost your submission. But then we found it, and we're not going to publish it.
Ouch.
And that killed me. That was and like, I think my advice is like, you can't let these things become personal because they really do sort of just like shut you down. And then, so since then, a couple of things happened. Since then, I got like incredibly politicized, and started to have some like ideas about the way in which publishing the literary world works. And, you know, like any other system, it's one that like advantages wealthy white men, wealthy cisgendered heterosexual white men more than other, people. And, so then getting published in like smaller journals, online journals, or anthologies and things became less and less important to me. And I started to realize that like my publication track record doesn't say anything really about the quality of my writing. I think publication track records say a lot about the publishing industry and what people believe sells. And if my writing's not tied to that, like, I feel like I'm not trying to become super wealthy. I'm trying to just like express and get my art out there. And in the same way that like somebody who's a musician and does like a DIY album, you know, they're like, I put a lot of work into these songs. I made this album. I'm putting it out there for the world because that's part of the, creative life cycle is like releasing it for an audience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to make the most money. I mean, I hope it makes money and I'm going to like pound the pavement and bust my ass to sell my collection. And make sure that everyone I talk to for a good 4 years buys my book. Because it's the nature of the game, unfortunately, and like that's how capitalism works. But like it took some work, but I don't think that like my worth as a writer is going to be tied to sales, and it's not going to be tied to a publication track record. For me, like, my work and the quality of my work is within the work, and if you want to know if I'm a good writer or not, then you should read it.
Sure. Well, good. So lastly, I'd like to ask you, what would you say has been the best advice you've ever received?
This was, oh my gosh. So I had originally thought of like a couple of different things, but actually one of my professors from graduate school, reached out to me when I was on my first election, or shortly after my first election where I was a campaign manager. And, she was like, oh, how's life treating you? How's New York? Like, how's the writing coming? And I was like, to be honest, like, I haven't really been writing a lot, which is why I haven't been, socializing with like the online alumni community as much. I guess I feel kind of bad about it, but I found this job. I have this day job. I'm making more money than I've ever made in my life. And I'm really good at it. And I like really believe in this cause. And her advice was, she was like, writing is always going to be there. You're always going to be a writer. If you need to put it down and survive and feed yourself and pay your bills, do that. And when you're ready, you'll come back. And it was just that simple. It was like, oh, I don't have to feel bad for not writing anymore. And that was in 2014. So I didn't even go back to writing shortly thereafter. I waited for the election, to burn me out. But it was the right time to do that. It was, I was like, okay, I like set it down for a while and I did this other thing, this political job. And now that's a garbage fire. So I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to pick this thing back up. It's always going to be there for you to pick it back up. And, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, sexism, ableism, they're like horrible structures of power that will divest you of your time and distract you and derail your life. And until we dismantle all those systems, we should allow ourselves to let those things happen. Like if they happen. So like if you're struggling as a writer and you're working on the manuscript and, things are getting really hard, like it might be the best route to set it down for a minute and make sure that you're okay. This also reminds me of some advice that my mom likes to say all the time, which is from airplane flights from